So, Jon, it's so delightful to finally have you on this channel here. You have your own YouTube channel, but very much welcome here.
Thank you very much, Sturla. It's a pleasure.
And I have to tell everyone who sees this, I've been enjoying many videos about mythology and myths, and your approach to them. I've enjoyed them so much. So I'm happy to be able to introduce you to people who are on this channel in case they don't know you, and the talk that we're going to have now. I'm looking forward to that. Really, absolutely.
Me too.
Yeah, and we have we can talk for hours. I'm certain.
Almost certainly, yes.
Yeah, and I've been trying up front now to find 5 points where we'll touch into Odin and maybe some Germanic mythology, Norse mythology, of course, and the roots of Scandinavian folklore or myths, and we can go. How far back do you want to go, right?
But to the very beginning. We can.
Absolutely. You have on your own channel, you have some of the world's oldest stories, right? And
old creation myths.
Exactly.
The oldest immortality myths. So creation, immortality, death, flood myths. They're pretty standard in most cultures.
And the world's oldest stories, basically, right?
Yeah.
And
allegedly oldest stories.
Of course. So this is what I'm going to do now. I'm going to try to ask you first if you could tell us a little bit about yourself before we get into dive into all this stuff. So if you wouldn't mind. Please go ahead, Jon, and tell us. You're based in London, I see. And
yes, I'm born and bred in a place called Crecganford, which is or was known as Crecganford, which is why the channel is called Crecganford.
I see.
And it sort of ignited my interest in history and mythology because there were some Anglo-Saxon earthworks here. There's a whole story around those, which I quite enjoyed. So, as I grew up, I wanted to know about those. I learned some about Anglo-Saxon history and myth, and then I started learning about Germanic and Nordic mythology and realised there's a lot of similarities there. And then as I did that, I understood or started to learn about European mythology and Indo-European mythology, and that's where I've spent a lot of my time, certainly in the recent years, last 5 years or so, just really focusing on that to try and understand the stories behind myths. So I run a YouTube channel. After the last few years of the pandemic, I decided to start a YouTube channel because teaching at university went into online mode, so students couldn't come in. So I thought, what can I do with my time practically? And I guess I created this channel to allow me to teach people why myth exists and the stories behind the myths that exist.
And what I like about your approach here is, one thing, you're very much into computers and programming, I guess, and using both algorithms and even AI to construct and follow relationships. It's almost like linguistically you can follow languages going really far back in time, and you can do the same thing with myths, right? In a sense.
Yes, as you can with DNA as well. Talk about and there's some probabilistic outcomes of that. But yes, certainly one of the things I do to keep me fed, because academia doesn't pay well, is IT, because IT pays very well. And one of the things I do in IT is AI development, especially around understanding language and language translation, and that helps me tremendously in this particular role, because it allows me to access information I wouldn't necessarily have and access it in a very rapid way.
Do you have a mathematical mind, would you say?
I love maths. I absolutely adore maths, behavioral economics and algebra. And I absolutely love those things, puzzles. Yeah.
The same with me. And I use that as a historian. I'll tell you, I have this thing with, how do you say it in English, synesthesia? Do you know what? Where you can see abstract both colors and numbers. Yeah.
Synesthesia. It isn't something I am blessed with, but I just love numbers, and
And
You
I
can't
also
go
have a
wrong with
mind for numbers, but more on the years. And the way I approach history is to have so many different layers and of the overviews, and try to see connections. And to me, it's very mathematical, because I find in modern times now we view time very much linear, connected to progress. But to me, everything is how do you say it? Cycluses.
Yes, it's cyclical. To me, it's
right.
data points. You know,
Exactly, binary, zeros and ones.
Exactly,
Right?
exactly.
Yeah.
When you know where the data points are, you just have to pull the right bits together to get what you want. But to try and visualize how my mind sees some of this data is next to impossible. I mean, there are graphs and maps I would love to produce, but I just can't, because there's no way to get that complexity of a temporal graph on top of a geographic graph on top of a dispersal graph on top of a mythology graph all together. In 2D. You can't do it. And that is one of the things I'm really trying to work towards, and I would love to have concluded before I retire.
So we have some similarities there. And for me, it's when so many things are happening over and over again, and you can connect it and view it in so many different ways, you tend to study the patterns more than the content, in a sense, right? And
you have to. Yes, you have to ignore the content and look for the same cycle, the same core story. Yeah.
And that's where we meet, because the cool thing about this is really DNA and all the DNA studies that have come out in the past few years. And for me, so many things are falling into place, and other things are having to be thrown out the window in a trial and error kind of way, which is the perfect scientific approach, of course, with the hypotheses. And just a couple of weeks ago, or this week, 1 week ago, this Johannes Krause and his team, Cosimo Post, and many really, really good geneticists posted a new paper on the Neolithic population of Europe, and also going further back in time. And I have to admit, and I have to give some people that I disagree with the benefit of the doubt, or actually the right way. And I had to throw out a couple of hypotheses. So it's all changing, and that's
Is that where the bow and arrows were found? The arrowheads were found. Are you talking about that paper?
Sorry,
which one? Are you talking about the finding where the arrowheads were found? And
no, not that one. I read that one too.
Sapiens. Yeah, that to me, that was astounding. 54,000 years ago now, Homo sapiens, and they were using arrows, rather than spears, which I think is a significant influence in the Homo sapien domination over Neanderthals at that time.
Absolutely, and they can see that the Neanderthals continued with spears and hunting the old way.
Exactly.
And so you can see the transition here. And this is, to all of you who are watching now, we've been talking for 8-9 minutes. This is the introduction. But point 5 on our schedule of what we're going to talk about, we're going to dive into a little bit about that, going really far back into time. And then I'll mention that paper, but it's not so important at this time. One thing though, before we really get started on number 1, because you're not the only one, of course, who have been studying myths and how myths are connected, and you can trace them further back in time. And I've been reading a little bit about Joseph Campbell and his work, and there was this TV series in the 80s, and then a book, and I really books, and I was curious before we start to hear your thoughts on him and his work, if that has influenced you in any way.
Not as much as many people would like it to. So Joseph Campbell looks at myth in a way we call universal mythology. So he believes all myth comes from a single source. That's a view that there's a single point and myth comes from a Jungian view, very, very similar. And some myths do come from a single source, but many, many, many more do not. And so he created this story, this archetype story of a hero's journey, I think he called it.
Yeah, hero's journey. A book in the late 40s.
Yes, and many authors use it. It's a really, I'm sure Hollywood probably uses it as a standard approach to create a story. The hero starts, has a bad turn, then succeeds in and goes down again, then raises to
that
success.
Star Wars, I know. I read
Absolutely.
about that. And that's, you want that character development, which many people who make TV shows and movies today seem to have forgotten. But you need that character development, the transition from being a little bit unknown about how the world works, and then
the discovery, and that. So I think there's 12 steps to the journey. So it's very interesting, and I certainly would consider using his work to influence any fiction I would write. But and he does raise some good points, and I've got many of his books behind me. But he isn't a source I go to regularly in my studies.
And to all of you who know Jon and his channel from before, he's got a new background here on the side there. And that's because you got a new library, right?
I have, yes. I've just built a library myself. Something I've been wanting ever since I started the YouTube channel, and I thought I'd do this on a more regular basis. So it's a very happy place for me.
Maybe I should have a library too. Yeah, that's something. I'm going to do something now that now we're finished with the introduction here, and I'm going to grab myself a cup of tea. Yeah, which is what Jon always says on his channel. If you want to follow along, grab yourself a cup of tea. And that's what I'd like to do now, because I'll follow your advice. And I imagine you got a cup of tea now, right?
No, I've had about 20 cups of tea today, so I'm on the water now to start. Really? Otherwise, I'll never go to sleep. I do love tea. Tea is like tea's a liquid hug to me. It's like it's a warm friend, which is necessary in certain days.
So I'm ready to start now, and I've suggested to you that we start a few centuries before the start of the Nordic Bronze Age. Just because when I view history, I was before, when I was younger, I was very focused on the Indo-European tribes, the migrations, and how they entered Europe. And a lot of people took their first DNA test, wanted to see if your straight paternal line goes back to Central Asia, and they're so warrior-like, And now that we know the picture is so much more nuanced, if I can say that.
Absolutely,
complicated, and especially this new DNA paper last week just mixes up everything in terms of who they were, because we see a lot of farmer DNA and Eastern hunter-gatherer and ancient North Eurasian, and there's so much going on, and this adds to this myth thing. But then I've had several transitions here, a hero's journey, you might say, in my own searching within in terms of history, and regarding this binary approach to the way you view history, I find you can talk about history in terms of from one people or one tribe that have mixed with other tribes, and which is very traditional, or you can use a geographical standpoint. I'm writing now a book about 12,000 years of Norwegian history, which will come out this fall. So I'm more writing about the geography of Fennoscandia, actually. How everything that went on looked from up north, because not too many people, well, I haven't seen anyone do it that way. But the thing is, people enter all the time, and we see in DNA that geography has a lot to do
influences the dispersal of humans, definitely.
Yes, absolutely. And I've talked about this in one of my videos here. If you have genetic memory, I say, but there's so many traits up north in Norway that we find in the Middle Ages and in the Viking Age and before, that is so equal, but it has to do with planning and surviving. And those who aren't able to plan, they die out, basically. So you got to plan. And that creates a sort of conformity in society that a lot of people hate in Norway. Because if you stick your head out, nobody likes that, because you can destroy the whole community. Everyone can die, just like on a boat along the shore here in Norway.
Exactly, yes.
So I can talk a lot about that. We're not going to do that now, but the thing is, I find this a little bit interesting in terms of how you view history, and for me to view history through catastrophes or great changes, climate-wise, or
or disease is a good one. If you're in DNA,
exactly.
disease is a key one. The plague is certainly in terms of influence of Europe.
And that's what I have suggested with number 1 that we're on now, that we start with 4,200 years ago, because we got this thing called bond events. And if it's all right by you, I'll do a short introduction about that before I get on to what we can talk about in terms of myths, if that's all right by you, Jon.
Sure.
Yes, because I'd like to show you who are watching here now. I can share my screen here, and I'll show you just this thing about bond events. Let's see if we're able to get this on now. And these bond events is a very here we go. It's a very nice way to view history on, because we see that there have been many disasters, and many times we see disasters that are connected, occurring at the same time. The biggest one was about 8,200 years ago, the 8.2K event. And then we have the 4.2K event here. And we can also the Fimbul winter that a lot of people talk about 1,400 years ago, and the fall of the Bronze Age, the late Bronze Age collapse. But I'd like to start off with 4,200 years ago. So that's like 2,200 BC about. And what we see here is some huge changes. Now, at this time, we're in the Bronze Age in continental Europe, but not Bronze Age in Scandinavia yet.
No, not yet.
No. That's about 3,700 or 500 years later. And what we see once the Bronze Age start, we see around, there's this interesting paper, which is not DNA, it's regarding isotope analysis. It looks on the movements of peoples, and it finds that around 1600 BC, meaning 3,600, they see a huge spike in migrations, and of course trade and people mixing, which is very interesting. And 4,200 K event, as you can see here, Jon, it says here that it had caused the collapse of the Old Kingdom in Egypt, Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia, and even in China, the first Neolithic civilization there, a drought that also may have initiated the Indus Valley in the Fertile Crescent, so many collapses. And we do know a lot about this time, and the new DNA evidence also is so interesting to view how these. I hope you like the background here, but I'll move it up like this. But it's so interesting the way the new DNA papers also confirm a lot of these movements, because prior to this, we know there was a huge volcano eruption on Iceland. It's called Hekla 4, and then you have Hekla 3, and then of course Hekla 2 and 1. But Hekla 4 and Hekla 3 were really, really huge, and also they're connected with each of these bond events with the late Bronze Age collapse. It might have been 1 or 2 centuries after that, actually, but these were the dark times, as they call it, before the time of Homer, even.
Well, sort of.
Yeah. Sort of.
Because Homer isn't a real person, and his stories were already in existence at this time.
Absolutely. I'm glad you point that out. And what I'm thinking here, at this time, we have seen that, I'm just putting my tea bag everywhere now. You who focus so much on the tea, I was thinking we would have a nice tea together here. But what I'm seeing here is we've had a period of about 1,200 years prior to this, with the funnel Beaker culture emerging, about 3,400 BC. We see some migrations of the
Significant migration at
Viking
this
culture
point,
going
yep.
south, right? And the
And
Viking
into
culture is
England,
interesting.
or
Sorry,
Britain.
go ahead.
And into Britain. So you start seeing,
yes,
you know,
absolutely.
Europeans see about, because they sort of acquire the knowledge of sailing at this point,
Exactly.
which is why you see that expansion going around here.
Yeah, exactly. And the Balkans, not the Balkans, I mean the Balticum, present-day Estonia, we see also a lot going on in that direction.
And that's for slightly different reasons, with my understanding, yeah.
Yes, and Balticum is a very special place in terms of myths, because so much has survived. The last place in Europe to get Christianized, in a sense.
Yes.
But Johannes Krause, the DNA researchers I've been working with and in touch with for the past 2 years, he has written a book, a very short story about the DNA throughout history. And in this book, I can link down below for people who are viewing this. He talks about how he sees that the Beaker culture wasn't, of course, it was Neolithic, and this was before the Yamnaya warriors came in.
Or at least it started before them. Yeah,
it started.
They
before
sort of acquired it. They acquired that knowledge really quickly.
Yes.
So well, it'd be quite interesting to actually see if we agree on how or why the Indo-Europeans came in to Europe. I mean, the actual migration of Near East and Indo-Europeans into Europe is, I think, is quite an interesting story. So my understanding, and so you can correct me because your DNA knowledge is probably far better than mine, is that we see, we see Near Eastern migration coming through Anatolia and into Greece and then Romania up the Danube, and then it stops. And this is around probably 6,500 BCE, I think it is, and we believe it stops at these more or less at the Alps because the climate and the geology changes. So people have come from a sort of a clay, sandy type world where they can farm, and they've come into this green forest hill land, and that isn't suitable farming. It takes them 1,000 years or so, 1,500 years to work out how to farm, and then we start see them creating wooden huts and wooden buildings and go into Germania. And then I think Indo-Europeans at this time are starting to travel into Europe, and there's trade going on. And we see that the Near Eastern cultures are breeding within themselves. So they've come as family groups, family units, and large numbers. So there's enough diversity in them so they can breed within themselves. But then when the Indo-Europeans start coming in, a couple of things happen. One, they don't migrate straight away because they have a geography problem, i.e. the hills and forests of Germania aren't the same as the steppe, so they need 1,000 years. But also what we find is that they bring the plague, I understand. And we see the plague then wipe out a significant proportion of the Near Eastern migration because they haven't got that immunity within them. And that sort of opens the door quite significantly for the Indo-Europeans then to flow into Europe, and but they only come as males. They don't come as females, so they immediately start interbreeding with Near East, the Near Eastern dispersal into Europe, as well as the hunter-gatherers in that area.
Exactly,
and that's how I believe the population forms. And it's quite interesting to understand that because it allows you to understand why there is influences of myths from Near East and Indo-Europeans sort of coming together at different mixes, or an admixture, I guess you call it in a genetic term. You get these different sort of amounts of mix. So
maybe we can do this easy for those who are watching this. Okay. We're talking because this is leading up to the Bronze Age, and the reason why I wanted in number 2 to go into the Bronze Age is because a lot of leading archaeologists in Scandinavia, just like Christian Christensen, he's emphasizing again and again that the roots of the Viking Age lies in the Bronze Age. And I think that's fairly interesting when we get into the myths there, the mythical landscape of the Norse, basically, because prior to this, we have a period, as you talk about now, the Yamnaya coming into Europe 4,800 years ago about, and then you had the early European farmer called EEF, coming in from Anatolia. You see that first the Yamnaya warriors are coming from the east, but they were probably closely connected to the Mycop culture in the Caucasus region, who had both the wheel, but also these maybe the Kurgan graves, but that's something that was early on.
Almost certainly, because that forced the migration. So my understanding from mythology is that the patriarchal societies, when the father died, the eldest son inherited his land, and the other sons then had to go off somewhere to find land. So that forced that dispersal.
That's a change that we later see in the Viking Age, with the Vikings settling in Normandy, for example. They had this thing called primogeniture. The eldest son inherits everything, but the other sons don't. So they got to build a career or life or legacy for themselves, right? But the Franks, who were Germanic tribe, of course, they didn't have that for some reason. And the Rus Vikings, they had a different way where uncle normally would inherit before son. Leading to mathematically a much better way to spread out far. But then it would be horrible because it's so easy to split and divide if some Mongol tribes, for example, come in and take over, which is what happened in the 13th and 14th centuries. But so we're talking about this Yamnaya. It's called Yamnaya. It's these Indo-European speaking warriors, spread the language, changed the culture in Europe forever. And all men, as you said, and in the Caucasus, the Mycop culture is interesting, but we're really far back in time then. But the thing with the wheel helped them because these were herders, basically.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? Yeah. So they speculate, or Johannes Krause is one of those who speculate that these Kurgan graves, they had them also as road signs, basically on the steps. That they buried their dead among the places where they would normally migrate through or go back and forth. It's an interesting hypothesis because we see that in Norway also, because we have all these mounds, burial mounds, the ship burials, but all the mounds also back in the Bronze Age, but then in the stone mounds, and we have them all over, and they seem to be always connected. Like the biggest one, Raknehaugen in Norway, the biggest one in Scandinavia, is right where people would have the led, as we call LAD. It's where you would travel through. So we'd always travel through where all these strong historical persons were buried, and you would pay them a visit, or I don't know. But it's interesting in that mind to see if there are some connections, because I also find the focus on animal ornaments from the Indo-European tribes, and also the Scythians. You find so many similarities later in the Germanic and the Viking period with the animal ornaments that they use. But it's just a hypothesis if there is a connection there. But
it might just complete the discussion, give another side of that. So my understanding is because the Kurgans you get buried on top of your generations. So you see a son buried on top of a father, on top of a grandfather. To me, it's more likely, certainly the Kurgans near the steppe, to be a marker of who owns the land as opposed to a direction. But it may be that it's located at a part of the land where people travelled past, maybe if there is as a marker. But to me, it is more of an indication that we own this space and this is our family's land.
That could very well be, because this was also a very clan-based society, like we later see in the Bronze Age and also at the beginning of the Viking Age, where clans were really, really important. And I've been a lot in Kazakhstan and also in the Caucasus, in different countries there, but especially on the steppes in Kazakhstan, when you meet the nomads who greet us as family. When we come, they say, you are Vikings, but you're also nomads at sea, but we are nomads at land, they say. And they have a so much closer relationship to time. For them, 1,000 years is nothing in the sense of genealogy. And they talk about how all these tribes would travel out, but they would always gather in these areas they conquered. They would gather concubines or women from the different areas they conquered. And they would come to the ruler, all these women, or I guess the most beautiful ones or whatever. And here's the deal. When they had sons, the sons would be raised at the court of the clan leader. And then the sons would be sent back to where their mothers were from, with the Comitatus, the Männerbund, meaning the group of warriors that were subjugated or lived or in the disgrace to die before the one who you pledge your oath to, right? And then you have all these people going out and to where their mothers are from, who are in the same clan. And they would continue then expanding their own empire and getting women from
very successful way of expanding.
So it goes on. Mathematically, it's a very good way to spread your DNA. But yeah, so we have this landscape here, and I was pointing to three things here now. We have the early European farmers, right, and we have the Yamnaya warriors. The first Yamnaya warriors coming into Europe, we see come actually down south towards Balkan, and probably picked up. We're not sure where they picked up bronze, but this all went very quickly in a sense in which direction they came first, because they came north in Europe very, very quickly. And no wonder, because the steppe landscape is also north of the Carpathian Mountains. It's straight into Northern Europe. And what I find is intriguing is the hunter-gatherers in this landscape. Because in Norway, I'm not sure if you know this, John, but if you take DNA tests of Norwegians, and I'll show you mine here now, autosomal DNA tests, I mean, you can actually see how much a farmer or how much...
Yes. I'll just play this a bit when talking about Indo-European migrations. That certainly Northwestern Europe tends to have a larger chunk of I guess you call it Yamnaya and hunter-gatherer than farmer. And then when you go to Northern Mediterranean, especially Sicily, it's almost reverse. It's all European farmer and a bit hunter-gatherer and very little Indo-European. And
Sicily is really, really interesting in that sense. Yeah,
it's very isolated. Like that, yeah.
Yes, and lots of hunter-gatherers there, but it's Western hunter-gatherers, haplogroup I2. I'm I1, by the way. Okay. And if I might show you here now by taking up this, here we go. Maybe you can see this here, right?
Yep.
So you can see, this is my autosomal DNA from family tree DNA. And you can see the hunter-gatherer portion there is 51%. And not so much, I didn't have that much of these Yamnaya warriors in my autosomal DNA, which is quite interesting. The farmer component is rather high, but it's interesting still. So my point is that a lot of Scandinavians, I have this from family tree DNA, the research and development leader of the department there is a friend of mine. He's been on this channel, and he's Swedish, so he's interested in Scandinavian research on Scandinavia. And what he points out is that you, in terms of hunter-gatherer DNA, you got close to 50% in Norway, you got 50% in Sweden, and 42%, I think the number is for Denmark. Even if you in Denmark had a population turnover, meaning that it was 0% at some point before the Bronze Age, meaning around the 4.2K events. So something has been going on, and this new DNA paper that came out last year, it's a preprint only, and I think it will be split up now, tells all the story about how there were two population turnovers, the funnel beakers first, when these warriors came. That's when we see these palisades, these defense systems being towards the end of the funnel beaker culture, and probably in relations with the warriors. It was a very violent time also.
Literally Indo-Europeans took over that culture, isn't it?
Exactly. So you have this, but the thing is, it's rather weird that all these hunter-gatherers have survived in Scandinavia. We call them Scandinavian hunter-gatherers, but they were originally split in mainly two, the Western hunter-gatherers and the Eastern hunter-gatherers. And now we know that the Yamnaya warriors, they also had a lot of Eastern hunter-gatherers in their DNA. And in addition, there is this new paper I talked about. We see that they try really to find the sources. They call it now Sildenko instead of the Eastern hunter-gatherers. No, sorry. The Sildenko is the Yamnaya warriors.
Okay.
And Oberkassel is the Western hunter-gatherers. But that's when it comes to they try to find the sources of the Yamnaya warriors in terms of DNA.
Yeah. Well, it's one of the mysteries.
Exactly, and they find 70% ancient North Eurasian, and the rest, 30%, is a little bit farmer, surprisingly, and a little bit hunter-gatherer, not surprisingly, I guess, but Eastern hunter-gatherer.
I'm not surprised about the farmer. So the more I research my mythology, the more influence I can see of early Neolithic farmers influencing the early Indo-Europeans.
Good. We're getting to the point now. That's great, because that's something we see. And when these Yamnaya warriors came to Scandinavia, they met the Beaker culture, but they also met a lot of Scandinavian hunter-gatherers who, from before, not only had Eastern hunter-gatherer in them genetically, but a lot of the Eastern hunter-gatherer also came from ancient North Eurasian.
Yes.
So yes, and we have this thing in genetics. No, I'm a historian, right? Not a geneticist, but they have this thing called canalization, which is rather cool in terms of DNA, because if you mate with someone, have offspring, in terms of which genes are selected, this is very relevant to the geography. We see around the middle of the globe, we see the same DNA in the Americas and in Africa, the same genes, that is. But you don't see it further north. But so are they from the same source? And yes, they are. This is canalization. These are people who have been thousands and thousands of years apart. When they come to a new climate, then they on and off switches of the DNA genes.
Well, that's evolution. Yeah. How would you?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, environmental influences are significant in that. Yeah.
Yes. So basically, it's rather interesting in this time period before the start of the Nordic Bronze Age. And what I find is that if you focus on the three, we have the hunter-gatherers who spread all around Europe, but in Scandinavia we also had the Eastern hunter-gatherer component, and they mixed in with the funnel Beakers, and that was the first migration out of Scandinavia around 3,400 years ago.
I mean, it may be worth mentioning as well that the Younger Dryas event, which is before this, actually forced the population squash. So you find that there was much migration south to the northern Mediterranean, which caused sort of mixtures. So we see the Western hunter-gatherers, I think they split into two groups eventually. And as before, just as you see farming start in the Near East, that's my understanding of the latest DNA. And then when it warms up again, they go back up. So that'd be quite interesting that the hunter-gatherers we see in Scandinavia were probably at the northernmost fringes of that Younger Dryas period to keep them separate from the admixture going on down towards sort of Anatolia and Iran, Iraq today. And
regarding the myths here, before we go into the Bronze Age, I see that we have these traces of shamanism in a lot of the hunter-gatherers. We also have a lot of fertility cults in Scandinavia, close to where I live, actually. There are two places with so much vulva and phallus inscribed in the stones, which are thousands of years old. But also, of course, the early European farmers, they also were into fertility. Isn't that so?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well,
that's a different kind of fertility, right?
Any culture with...
Well, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, any culture with males in it tends to have fertility as a key archetype.
Yeah, that's rather weird. Yeah.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, that's how they focus, isn't it? Must be a DNA thing. But yes, it's a different kind of fertility. Yeah, they were understanding, I think, how fertility worked because what we find with communities, because people forget that farming also introduced larger communities, and larger communities create certain social understandings, and it creates sort of hierarchy in politics and all those wonderful things that come with it. And so you get the understanding of actually how fertility works and how sex works, where it's quite plausible that hunter-gatherers didn't really understand how sex really worked in terms of pregnancy. They probably understood that sex led to a baby, but they didn't necessarily understand the 9-month cycle of that, or when they did it, or why it worked sometimes and other times. So the fertility was more magical in that sense.
And because we're getting into magic, I know very soon now. What I, as a Scandinavian, it's a little bit easy for me to picture how these hunter-gatherers would have looked on this, because I'm so close to nature, and I have this. I don't like people concentrations like cities, and when you start to grow crops, and you have animals, and you get concentration of people, you also get a lot of diseases and pandemics. And so it's so much more up and down. And I read, again, I think David Reich, this other geneticist.
Okay, David Reich.
At Harvard. I think he wrote about how little work the hunter-gatherers had to do to survive each day.
Relatively,
compared to the farmers.
Exactly, right, which is why farming is a bit of a mystery. Why would you want to farm, work harder, eat less food? It doesn't make sense. But there are benefits of being in society.
But for me as a Scandinavian, to look at what happened further south, and they traveled over huge distances, right? They were very mobile in a sense, so they could. I'm sure they knew about the farming revolution and the spread of farming throughout the continent.
They would have at some point. They would have been very much aware of it. Yes,
exactly. And to me, the main difference is to enslave the earth, to enslave animals instead of following them in herds, and to enslave people, because there was slavery at this time also, is something completely new. And I'm trying to get into an angle here on the mythology or the myths, because also when you clean the earth, as we say in Norway, when you want to start farming, you have to remove trees, of course, but also stones. Yeah. And in Norway, they built, in the Middle Ages, they built fences out of the stones, and I'm sure they did in the UK too. But we also know when the Neolithic period really started in southern Scandinavia, they started, and in the UK, they started building these huge megaliths, and they would also, the most economical way to move stones, it would be basically just to gather the stones as economically as possible, in the sense of, you get pyramids. That's my point. You get something elevated. And to me, it's only logical that they were so dependent on the sun. It was huge disasters if crops failed or if the climate changed or anything like that. So many people died, so much trauma.
Lots of myth about that.
Exactly. And the hunter-gatherers, by comparison, they had to adapt to whatever climate or weather or whatever happened with the animals. They just adapted the whole way. Now this happens, we do this, instead of forcing your way with the property that you own in terms of farming. So I see these huge differences here. Like with fertility, I would imagine that they were much more focused on the sun cult. That we see emerge in the, I guess, early Bronze Age. Would that be correct?
Oh, it was definitely going there, but it would have been earlier than that. So it would have been as farming is starting. So what some people don't necessarily understand is that we didn't just start farming. We were eating grasses 20,000 years ago, and then 16,000 years ago we were harvesting maybe 10 or 20% domestic crops. And then as time gets closer, those domestic crops grew and grew till it was 100% of our food source. So there was a development over time with that. And I think what you'll find is that as that happened and as communities came, we see the personification of gods. So you move from animism and in effect being in one with nature to having gods that are human shaped, human form. Yeah. Because if you're in a community, a large community, that is what you're seeing. You know, you lose touch with nature. You need a god that is like a king and a warrior and a hero. Yeah. And that's how we get that transition, I believe, from animism to a pantheon.
And that's a difference, I guess, with the hunter-gatherers in the way they had fertility. It was important for them, but it was more important for the tribe, and it's a whole different spectrum.
Exactly, very different world, very different world, and that's one of the things I like. Why I study mythology is to try and unlock some of those. Exactly. Call them secrets, you know. There's some. They must have considered esoteric knowledge, you know, some. And to try and unlock some of those from the myths is quite interesting to get a view of the culture. And when we see that, I love that about Indo-Europeans and their view of the cyclical nature of life, and you have to give what you take.
So would you say that when these warriors came in, the Yamnaya warriors, it seems like they brought along the personification of gods. I mean, in Egypt they had a sun god, of course, but when I'm thinking of the whole Greek mythology and the Norse mythology, it seemed to be related with Indo-European roots or Proto-Indo-Europeans, perhaps. Is there a difference there with farming, in a sense?
I believe farming brought that in, and the Indo-Europeans then grew that, and that's because we see that in the creation myths. So the creation myths, I mean, the earliest creation myth we know, we have a primary source of, is the Enuma Elish from Mesopotamia, from the Babylonian myth of creation. And we see this format of two primordial beings having children, and the children kill the father so they can marry the mother to have a son, that son kills the father to marry the mother, or marries a sister to kill the mother. And you see this really incestuous, murderous thing go on for 4 or 5 generations before you in effect, it's sort of to almost establish a divinity for the people who are ruling, for the gods who are there. You're creating this image, which is very different to the Abrahamic religion, which was very canonical in terms of timeline. It was very much a story rather than a cyclical event. And this cyclical creation myth, you then see, and part of that myth is the sacrifice of the sexual organs of one of the key gods. So you get castration, and you'll see that familiar, the castration of Kóryos by Zeus, and that castration of these primordial beings seems to then influence. Well, you get this with the Nordic mythology with Ymir. So Ymir is twin, means twin in language. So the sacrifice of Ymir, the sacrifice of the twin, is seen as an evolution of the castration of the sort of primordial god.
Right.
So I think that's where the influence is.
Yeah. So it's linked to that way, but the Indo-European built on that, but they brought in their own.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, because they're war gods. Yeah, they want the war. So one of the things I find very interesting about mythology is, and I'm happy to have a discussion about this, everyone, is within the Nordic mythology, you have the Aesir and the Vanir gods. And to me, the Aesir are the Indo-European pantheon, and the Vanir are probably the leftovers of the European farming pantheon.
Thank you. I was waiting for that, you see, because in Scandinavia, it's quite interesting with the Vanir. It seems like you don't have, and I'm asking you, you don't have too many sources of the Vanir in the Germanic mythology, right? It's mostly in Scandinavia, right? And you mentioned, I think, in one of your videos that a lot of Indo-European names disappear in Scandinavia.
Exactly,
right?
They're not there. Yeah.
So something was there before that probably has continuity, right? And maybe this could be the Vanir. And you have in southern Sweden, you have Vänern, and you have so many places which is called Vanir, which is also sort of where it's placed, I find, in many of the sources. So could this, what we're talking about here, I'm trying to get back to DNA and my field here, but what we're talking about is this a mix then of the Yamnaya warriors meeting the funnel beakers, and because we know they mixed. We know that now from the DNA, right? And we know around 3,600 years ago in the Bronze Age, where we are now, that's when we see a lot of migrations. It's sort of like exploding. So what I'm thinking, maybe you have a transition period here, where they had to find out who was on top of each other in a sense,
and that's it. Yeah, and there is, and I talk about the archaeology of mythology, and I talk about, especially with Greece, that in Greece it's really obvious that you see European farming myth and Indo-European myth sort of combine at different levels. So Homer talks about one flavour, Hesiod another, and like Philus talks about another, and you'll see this. Apollos talks about another. So you get all these different Greek authors at different times talking about the same core story, but with different mixtures of influence within them, but the core story is the same. But yes, you then see that in the other mythology. And so one of the amazing stories is that of Balder. So Balder is actually, we believe, the equivalent
Balder,
of
as we say.
Balder. Ignore my pronunciation. He is in effect a agricultural god. His journey into the underworld is like Osiris and like other gods. Like specifically, it's that the agriculture goes underworld. Everybody's sad, and you get the tears. There's a story where everybody cries, which is the metaphor for rain, apart from Loki, and so he remains there. So you actually see real tangible evidence of the European farming myths still within Scandinavia, which again, it just adds to that evidence.
This is really interesting, because then you have a merger, right, of these different myths. And we also see the merger of DNA. And now we know pretty much about what this time when it happened. But there's another thing. As a historian, when I first started, there was this thing in Norway 25 years ago. They didn't want to do research on trade. It was too capitalistic. They didn't want to. It was really weird. It was very, let's stick to history like it is. But now in terms of trade, like I mentioned, some of the archaeologists, they talk about how trade exploded in Scandinavia in the Bronze Age, which has to do with all the resources that we have in Scandinavia, which is quite extraordinary. And if you don't mind, Jon, I'll show you guys a photo here. I'll just get it up right. Here we go. Because I think this is important to understand how to lay out the geography in a sense. And maybe I can just share this, Jon, to show you right here. Can you see this map here? This is yes, this is Europe, but the colors are elevation, right? Different heights. And to me, what is intriguing here, this is also important for the Iron Age, with all the bog iron that we had in Scandinavia to make iron, which we were self-sufficient in Sweden and Norway. But a lot of iron were brought out to Scandinavia and down through with the Germanic tribes. But we do see, because of all the sea mammals in the upper Baltic Sea and in the north of Scandinavia, with oil and fur and so much interesting stuff.
Very important stuff, yeah, very important.
And amber, not to say the least. You know, the Vikings, they slept on the best beds in the world because they had this feather from this one bird you only find up north, and this was so important. And Christian Christiansen, I mentioned him before, he said Scandinavia was, if not the one of the most richest places in the Bronze Age after this 3,600 when we saw trade pick up. And we know also a lot of Scandinavians, we know from the swords down in the, how do you say this, Mycenaean Greece or Mycenaean Greece?
Yeah, the Mycenaean. Mycenaean. You should be Mycenaean if you're really Latin, strictly with your Latin.
Yeah, we say that in Norway. Mycenaean. Mycenian or Mycenian?
Mycenian.
Mycenaean, that's a better way to say it.
Yes,
Yeah. So we see in this, we have religious people traveling down to a temple in Greece at that time. We see a lot of mercenaries coming down from
absolutely
Scandinavia at this time.
That shouldn't be underestimated, certainly with the expansion of Rome, the amount of mercenaries from Scandinavia that came to Roman legions
also in
to
the
fight.
Iron Age, you see so many. It's crazy. But they brought their own weapons, even, and armor.
And they brought their myths and their gods as well, which caused another clash and a mix of things going on.
Exactly, and going back and forth. I'm sure.
Exactly.
And what we see now genetically is that this mix started in the Bronze Age between the north and the south of Europe. And I'm wondering, maybe if you look on the mythology of this, that we also see this merger in a sense, in a larger sense, perhaps.
It's really hard because of sources of information. I mean, all we have for Scandinavia is the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda, really is, well, the Poetic Edda. And even then, both of them are, they're secondary sources, but there is influence from obviously the author and their biases. So it's really hard to tell. And again, we also see the lack of personification of gods in Germanic and Scandinavian tribes. So there is no statues or pictures to look at to see when that was coming in. I mean, Odin or Woden or Wotanaz absolutely looks like you could almost say he didn't exist before 500 CE. Although he did, I can show you where he comes from, or some of it from thousands of years. In fact, it's probably pre-Indo-European, his very earliest sources. But yeah, exactly. It's really interesting. Really interesting.
And I wanted to get to Odin, and perhaps this is a good time to do that, because in transition from the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, and to all you are watching, if you think we're moving too fast now, we didn't want to spend more than about 1 hour talking together, or a little bit more than 1 hour. But Jon has a lot of good videos on all these topics, so we don't need to dive into the specific details, because I got them covered on the DNA side, and you got them covered on the mythological side, right? But I saw in one of your videos that you talk about that Odin might not have existed. I mean, we talk about the Vanir, we talk about the Aesir, we talk about this merger of the warriors with something before, maybe the funnel beakers or whatever it was. And we haven't even gotten to the hunter-gatherers, by the way, which is my next point. But then suddenly this Odin name, Wotan, pops up, but so much later, which is really, really intriguing. And it would be easy to think that, maybe they were one of the last ones to come from the steps of these warriors and that's why we know the Odin name to have lasted. There were names before, or he resumed the role. But then the intriguing thing is Odin's search for knowledge, or quest, as you say, which is really, really cool. And that's sort of the last angle I wanted to talk with you about, because Odin doesn't go to many places to search for knowledge. He gets knowledge from the Jotner, and he gets knowledge from the Vanir, right? And he goes to some particular pains and strains and the trauma even to obtain this knowledge. He loses his eye, he hangs on the tree for 9 days and has that spear marked, right? Like
that's a very complicated, that's a whole day's conversation in its own right. That would be
absolutely. We need more than tea if you're going to talk about
you need more than tea, yes. But it's very, you could argue it's analogous to the trials of Hercules or something. A hero has to go through certain trials to obtain what they need to obtain. But Odin is incredibly complicated. He is without a doubt a mix of a number of deities and a number of views. But his name, I believe, I believe Anatoly Lieberman, who's a great etymologist, his belief is that Wodan or Wotanaz comes from Wotu, which is a Proto-Indo-European name for the leader of the wild hunt.
Oh yeah, okay.
So this leader of the wild hunt, the Wotu, comes to Wotanaz and to Wotan into Odin. So, which would make sort of sense, but he wouldn't have all the attributes that Odin has. There's obviously shamanistic influence in there. There's other influences too, in terms of warrior and the like. So I guess part of that, it comes into play with Romans and Scandinavians merging and war going on, and I'd imagine there's a lot of that in there. As long as there's shamanistic when you go back into Scandinavia, because you also lack a Loki figure in Germania. So it's like the myth has to have a balance. When Odin comes in, you need someone to balance Odin with, to create those stories. In effect, you need
and we're at the time period now where we know now for at least 2,000 years or 3,000 even, people have mixed quite a lot, really, and there's been quite a lot of migrations. And the sources that we have of Snorri, for example, it has to. I normally say this to view the myths that he wrote about when he actually wrote about poetry and how to make poetry.
Yeah, the Prose Edda is about poetry. Yeah,
exactly. So he used these ancient things that he knew about, but to go back and see what actually is there. You have to go through these crises like the Fimbulwinter or the 6th century that lasted until the middle of the 8th century, even the small cold period and the plague. And then we see that the elder Futhark changed into the younger Futhark, and we have so many. We have this footballer in England at Arsenal called Ødegaard.
Okay.
Yeah, Martin Ødegaard is his name. He's a Norwegian footballer. He's the captain of Arsenal. But his surname is Ødegaard, which means desolated farm. And that's a surname that a lot of Norwegians have, because after the Black Plague, there were all these farms that were desolated, or people have died there, of course. And the people who went up to live on that and to start farming there, they were called Ødegaard. That's why we have many people with the name named Ødegaard. So we know in his straight paternal line, because we still have primogeniture in Norway, we know that Ødegaard's father back in the 14th or 15th century settled on one of these Ødegaards, the farms that were desolated. At the same time, we find that also in the 6th and 7th century, the same number almost of farms being desolated in Norway at the time of the language changes. So we know the plague was most likely in Norway, and also was worse.
It was. I think there's a different flavour of the plague in Norway, if I remember, because there were a couple of varieties, and the one the Indo-Europeans brought was different to the one that started in Scandinavia.
It's the same bacteria, Yersinia pestis, but it has evolved when people moved, right? So it returned, and then we have the late Bronze Age collapse, and then we have the 4.2K event. And if you see this in try to see how far back these myths go. For me, just to look at what happened in the Iron Age with Germanic tribes, it's like looking through glass that have been distorted. And on the other side of that distorted glass, you have a mosaic of a puzzle that you don't have all the pieces, and you want to piece it together, right? And imagine what we're talking about now. We got to go through maybe 2 and maybe even 3 of these huge crises, which caused migrations, which caused new trading patterns, which caused new merger of both DNA and, of course, mythology, and the crisis and trauma, collective trauma, I'm sure. So it's really intriguing to try to puzzle this together, and you are one of those people who do a very good job with it. I find your approach to the science in it very. I'm very grateful that you do this, and I'd like to bring in the Scandinavian Hunter-Gatherers now before we finish off here, because we only have a few minutes left, Jon. And I'm going to show you a photo here to start with talking about the Indo-European tribes, and I have a hypothesis for you. So if you don't mind, we'll start with this woman here. This is an 8 or maybe an even 9,000-year-old skeleton that was found in present-day Germany, a hunter-gatherer woman, shamanist, who we know based on some, I can't say this in English even, something nasal that made her, it was easier for her to go into trance.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay, so breathing it affected her breathing to allow her to get into a state of...
Yes.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense, yep.
And what we know about the shamans, we have so many of them, and we know from the Germanic tribes of many shamans. We know Odin's quest, which is very complicated in itself. I have two hypotheses that I would like to finish off with you, John. Okay. One is that in terms of the Scandinavian hunter-gatherers, we know they were tall people, especially the Jotner. But I've seen your videos where you talk about maybe the Jotner weren't that tall, because you do have even depictions of Jotner that looked like or were like dwarfs, right? But that we have both tall people and short people up north in Norway. We still do today, you know, the Sami, for example, and we have strong shamanistic traditions in Norway up until present day. I know people who are Sami and are shamans actually even today. And everything is centered around alternate states of reality, going into trance to foresee the future, and I know people, women mostly actually, who have this gift of seeing people. And one woman I know, she says people call her all the time asking where my keys are. And she comes from this island where a lot of witches were burned, of course. But there's this strong tradition going really, really far back, which I am intrigued to say in a hypothesis that we find roots and a lot of traditions in the shamanistic ways of the hunter-gatherers. Not the Sami, but the Sami were mostly men who came to Scandinavia, and they found local women who were hunter-gatherers, right?
Yeah.
So the thing is, there is this great DNA paper on the Gothic tribes, Gothic migrations down towards Hungary, where they talk about, they've looked on the mitochondrial DNA, only the women.
Yeah.
And they see it's a strong genetic similarity between the women who were together with the Yamnaya warriors and the women who were together with the Beaker culture and the women who were hunter-gatherers.
Yes, that would make sense.
In the same area, right? And I'm thinking about traditions here, how stories are told, right? And I hope you see where I'm getting at here. But it's obvious that, we know from the Sami language that a lot of words are probably not from the Central Asian, the North Central Asia, where the Sami originated from, because we don't find these words in Finnish or Estonian, like lavo or gamme, which is almost like a lavo, so there are a lot of words that are perhaps a remnant of these women who stayed or who was there when the Sami men come. And we see the same thing with these Gothic tribes, that we see the mitochondrial DNA being pretty similar.
Yes, quite consistent.
Back, based on geography, basically. Even. So I find that very intriguing if you look at the hunter-gatherers and their focus on their way of fertility rites, the strong cult they had, and if things have survived even from back then in terms of Odin's quest for knowledge and the magic and the Jotuns that we talk about. They were actually very wise, right? They had a lot of knowledge, and they had also magic, lots of magic, right? So there's this one hypothesis I have on the connection that can go all the way back to the hunter-gatherers, the Scandinavian hunter-gatherers, that has maybe been a part of this mix of myths that people can tend to forget. That has obviously influenced Scandinavian or Norse mythology, and maybe we can see the difference here in the Germanic mythology, or maybe even in the Greek mythology, if there was a merger there as well. Now, the other part is about the Jotuns, because I think when we know that the average height of the Roman soldier was 160 centimeters, they tried to raise it to 165, but they had to put it down again. And the average height in Rome was 150 centimeters. And then when we know that there are many genes for height, the DNA wise, right? but we have this thing called canalization, where when people have been apart, like the Yamnaya warriors, we have the same DNA basically with the ancient North Eurasian as the Eastern hunter-gatherers who were tall. So you had tall
food
people
as well. Yeah,
exactly. So we had tall people like today in Scandinavia, both in the Bronze Age, who went down as mercenaries, no doubt, to the Mycenaean Greeks. We know in the Iron Age, when we, in addition to all these trading goods in Scandinavia, like the amber and the seal and the tusk even, but in the Iron Age they also had a lot of iron, right? And it was very well organized. On all the rivers going down from all the mountains, they sent down iron, bog iron, because it was only retrievable from a certain height, like I showed you on the map there. That's why they had so much iron in Scandinavia and not in the rest of Northern Europe. All the Germanic tribes were dependent on this. And we know the Germanic tribes now from DNA originated in Scandinavia, like we've seen linguistically for some time. But not just Scandinavia, but Northern Germany or Poland and Balticum as well. So there's this area there that's sort of like the funnel Beaker area. And so what I'm proposing here now is that we see a lot of the mix of the Jotuns with these warriors who mixed also with this Vanir. And it could have been 3 different tribes. And maybe the Vanir are more from the funnel Beaker culture, which we know also had Yamnaya warrior in them. And we know the Yamnaya warrior also had farmer in them, right? So there's this weird mix here. And what I'm proposing here to finish off for a comment from you is that when we know this DNA transition happened, the great mixing of peoples throughout these thousands of years that I'm talking about now, can we use that so we can put dates even to your work when you work with what different mythologies have entered at which stage, so we can actually maybe pinpoint the tree a little bit more? Would that be possible in your line of direction or as a scholar?
My work is probabilistic. So I talk about phylogenetics, which you may be familiar with. So what it may do is it may give us more confidence in dating myth, but it would still be very hard to understand at which mix did an amount of early European farming myth mix with Indo-European myth, because it is cyclical. You get the farmers come in, the Indo-Europeans come in, and then they mix and then come down and they mix. It's very difficult to actually place an exact date on that.
Of course. And I'm not talking about exact dates. I said
exactly. Even within anything before 2000 BCE is incredibly difficult to date. I mean, we're just talking after that, but we don't have the sources even. I mean, until the last 2 millennia. So it may be possible, but this goes back to one of our various conversations. Like, we have all this data in our heads, and it's very hard to put that in a visual 2D representation for people to understand. But if I could do that and then map the data you're talking about with the dispersal information we have, we may start getting indications, but it will be a very, I'd use the term foggy, so very,
of course,
like a different map. And the other thing I would have to say, and the one thing that really confuses me in all this, is that we know farming started 12,000 years ago or so, like properly really started. So that's when the myths were starting to be created. So why do we even see, even up to the middle of the first millennium, farming myths still being created and dispersed in the Indo-European region? So the Book of Kings in Iran has a version of the early European farming creation myth in it, in the fourth, I think it's the 4th, 5th and 6th Kings. They really map like analogously to the Greek creation myth and the Hurrian creation myth and the Phoenician creation myth, and therefore to the Enuma Elish. And it's like, so you have this period.
I mean, you're talking about the Talmud also now, right? And the Old Testament even.
Well,
right?
we can go into that even separate, because I can show Indo-European influence flow back into that with the worship of the cow, which is something, that's a big marker for us on understanding where Indo-Europeans influenced other myths.
Even in Norway, we have a myth, I'm sure about going. They used to. This is before the Viking Age, but they used to mark the field for battle, which is sort of like marking a football field, and they would come with a cow, and a sacred cow even. I mean, even in Norway, and bring it into battle. It's truly amazing.
It was a gift from the gods. It was so useful, the cow. It had to come from the gods. So it was, so it does. I mean, obviously time moved slowly before we got this technological revolution we're in now, but it's really hard for us to comprehend how slowly it moved, and so how it allowed myth to disperse and be maintained so well. And and I get challenged by that all the time. I mean, who's Jackson Crawford, you may be familiar with.
Yes.
Old Norse specialist. So I don't quite see eye to eye with Jackson on this, because he doesn't believe myths can persist through time. He believes they can change like the weather. And I'm saying, and one of the things I do is prove that they don't. They have truth in them. They're sacred, and so that forms persistence. But even now, to see such myths persist over such a time, even through Bronze Age and Iron Age and the rise of Christianity and into Islam, and you're still seeing the myth in there. It's just crazy. There's far more work to do, and I need more time still.
Yeah. and I think, John, before we take out those bottles of red wine and do an all-nighter after this, I think we can leave off there with because it's good that you mentioned Jackson Crawford. I meet that as a historian also. I'm part of those historians who believe, just like Thor Heyerdahl, in the strong or the strength of the oral traditions of so many peoples and tribes. And I come from a family. We have this big family on the coast where we talk about my aunt still. She's in her 80s, but she talks about a murder that happened 200 years ago, like it happened last year. And we had in the Middle Ages here in Norway, you had to remember to get your inheritance on land. You have to remember or name your family going 7 stages backwards. It was very, very strong oral tradition. And to my mind, this is no doubt. But we can also use this to see how those who have written down stories were influenced by Christianity, for example, or the times they lived in, or the kings they wrote for. And you can use that in order, just like you say, you have a mind for math. So that means you can use this and it's sort of like calculate even. But of course, it's possible, it's plausible, right? But we can't say something definite. But I would like to finish off, John. If you have you been to Norway?
Yes, I have.
Yes. Have you been up north in the wintertime?
No more north than Bergen and Oslo, unfortunately.
Because in terms of the hunter-gatherers, I would like to invite you to come north of the Arctic Circle and see not the midnight sun in the summertime. That's beautiful and all. But to see the nights when it's darkness for 3-4 months, because that is magical. Because then you live under a constant animated sky, a movie where the hunter comes up every day and he's hunting for the Pleiades, right? Or whichever myth you want to dig into, right?
Exactly.
And he's going around you, right? And you have the North Star, and when you're out there, like the Scandinavian hunter-gatherers were for thousands of years, and you see these stars, these celestial signs, which meanings and myths go around the North Star all the time. It's so amazing. So intriguing, and it creates a whole different level of understanding, I feel. And if you add into the knowledge, I know Carl Jung, you mentioned him, he said, beware of unearned wisdom. he talked about psychedelia then. But when we know how important these altered realms, or the homes, as we can say, and we haven't even talked about Yggdrasil or the tree.
Oh God, yeah.
We're not going to start there. but these altered states of being, and how important it was to enter this in terms of magic among the Scandinavian hunter-gatherers. There is so much more, I'm certain, and I would like to continue having a good relationship with you and talk about this, because I think we can,
like that too. Yeah.
We can go much further with this, especially with all this DNA that sort of, like for me at least, helps connect the dots.
Indeed, and it provides a level of evidence for me to feel more confident about how the dispersals work. But yeah, absolutely, I would love to do this more. As you say, glass of wine, cup of tea, and even in person in Norway would be fantastic.
Absolutely. We should try that. And I'm glad you were able to stay with me for 1 hour and 20 minutes now. I hope all you who are still viewing this have enjoyed this. And here is your page at YouTube. I've seen more of your videos on this. This is an old picture, by the way, so don't arrest me for this. and please go in and like and subscribe if you can.
Thank you.
To Jon's page. I had some questions from my patrons, and I have to find out how we can do that. But
we can do that. We can.
Well, if you have
tell me about go on. Yeah, we can be fine.
Quickly, because we hear a lot. One person asked me here. We hear a lot about Germanic tribes originating in Scandinavia and traveling south and outwards through the continent. But are there stories of the opposite happening, of migrations of Germanics traveling north into Scandinavia? And I guess that's a mythological question, or
well, we must do. I mean, Woden wouldn't become Odin if he didn't go north. You have to drop the W. So. Definitely do it. I mean, there is more than that. If you see, like in Saxo Grammaticus, he has a story on Balder as well, although it's somewhat different, but many of the characters are the same and principle. So we see that there is a connection between Norway and Denmark and into Germania.
Yeah, right. And we know from DNA that a lot of the Germanic tribes had very strong connections with Scandinavia, and we know from Lombards also, of course. Another question here for you, Jon. I wonder if the Vikings had totems or trees, and we'll let you answer quickly that, because the trees are very important to Vikings also, of course, at least in the start of the Viking Age.
Yeah, it's hard because those things don't survive. So, but we have, about the Irminsul as well as the Yggdrasil. The tree was important, and no doubt that was a throwback to hunter-gatherers or even shamanistic views of being connected with the earth. So, I see that as almost as a representation of the leader of the tribe, almost was absorbed into that or part of that, which is why it became so important.
Yeah. And another question, why is Sleipnir depicted with 8 legs?
A horse is twice as fast as a 4-legged horse.
Yes, I
think it's quite as simple as that. You want to show a super horse.
There's no need to overcomplicate things, I guess. And I'll leave you with the last question here now. If you can talk about Yggdrasil, let's not go there, because that's a rabbit hole for you and me together. But the number 9, I have a follow-up question there from this friend, I guess, on Patreon here, who asked about the number 9, because I guess you're familiar with these Saros cycles and the ability to predict the equinoxes. How do you say that?
Equinoxes, yes. And yes, exactly, yeah.
Because that happens every 18 years, and half a Saros cycle is every 9 years. And I think this is the ability to predict when the sun disappears or the moon disappears. Even back before the Bronze Age, maybe even if it's true that a lot of the stones, like at Stonehenge and Newgrange, where they were continued with the Yamnaya warriors right after they took over. But if some of these stones I've read, I haven't been there, I haven't seen it, but are actually part of that Saros cycle depictions. I'm not sure. Are you familiar with that?
I have some knowledge of that, but those sorts of patterns I'm a little skeptical about. So we see the number 9 in a number of cultures across Eurasia, as we do see the number 7 or the number 30 or the number 20. It's just a number people like. There's like a 10% chance of you picking a number between 1 and 10.
I would imagine in the Neolithic, John, when people are so dependent on the sun, that if you can predict when the sun will disappear, and if you see a pattern there.
Well, it's more to do with the moon. I think the moon was far more important than the sun.
Okay.
So
well, we know about sol and dag, or sun and day, and the sun wheel and all of that. So
that's the agricultural influence. So it would have been when agricultural influence happened. The sun's important, but before then, it's definitely the moon, because we see most of the markers are about the moon. Your days start when the sun goes down. Not when the sun comes up.
So can we leave that as a hypothesis that maybe the number 9 being holy among many people in Northern Europe has to do with the Saros cycles?
There is a chance that is correct.
Let's leave it at that. Yeah. So all of you who have been watching this and are still with us, thanks so much and for following us. And please put your questions below if you can. Please check out Jon's channel. I'm curious about your next video, Jon. Do you know what it is?
I'm going to do a tour of this library, and then I'm going to talk about the Near Eastern creation myth in my next 2 videos.
Wonderful. Looking forward to it.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks for now, Jon. And let's
it's been a great discussion, Stella. Thank you so much.
Catch up again soon. Yeah.
Okay.
Take care and bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.